Yeah, I'm Ryan House. I am a second-year PhD student in the Media, Cinema, and Digital Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I think one of my favorite things about coming to conferences is seeing all of the different talks and thinking about how they sort of correlate with the things that I'm interested in talking about. Toya's keynote this morning sort of made a lot of sparks go off. I hope this sort of, you can see a lot of links maybe to this, and Erica's talk just now, I'm going to talk about diegesis and mimesis a little bit, but not a whole lot. So yeah, I think it works out really well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Virginia and the ways that it sort of opens itself up to a plurality of readings, despite really only having one story to tell. Virginia is what's commonly known as a walking simulator, and I think it's typically used sort of in a negative connotation, but I want to argue that those types of games are expanding our definitions of games, right? They're moving beyond the methods of narration that we typically allow for games to have. Yeah, let's see if I can work this. Cool. Okay, so my thesis is that Virginia literalizes David Bordwell's constructivist theory of narrative film by requiring the player to execute filmic operations in order to frame narrative information within their point of view. If that doesn't make any sense, I hope it will in a few moments. So to explore this idea, I'm going to be talking about 2016's Virginia from Variable State. It's a game that's inspired by film and television as much as it is games. If you sort of get some flashes of Twin Peaks or Silence of the Lambs or X-Files in particular, it's no accident there. One of the main things that I think that interests me about this game is that there's no dialogue, neither spoken or textual. So everything is up to the player to interpret, everything narrative-based, I should say, is up to the player to interpret. My argument is that this is where the ludic activity for this game lies. It's light on game mechanics, but there's still playful activity. I should have, I'm going to click around on this just a bit to give you sort of an idea if you aren't familiar with the game. So players, it's a first-person game. There is sound. Everything's pretty abstracted. It's not a realist. And then you have some text to read, usually in the form of these case files. Another interesting thing is that the game uses, let's go ahead and pause that, sorry. It uses the filmic vocabulary. You'll notice that there's cuts to move the player forward in time. Typically, that scene, it's a long sort of trek down to your new partner's office in the basement, and it cuts 2 or 3 times to the elevator, to the stairwell, and then finally to the hallways in the basement. Jonathan Burroughs from Variable States stated that he was inspired by 30 Flights of Loving from Brendan Chung, which does a lot of the same sort of neat things with cutting, but that game takes about 10 minutes to play, and Burroughs was interested in doing this for a feature-length narrative, so Virginia is roughly about 90 minutes long. He said, quote, "We don't want the player to feel like they're witnessing cinematic play out around them. They should always feel like they are the character they are embodying, existing in the moment that they are experiencing." It's not quite clear. All right, now I am. Okay, so placing this emphasis on a player's immersed experience means relinquishing some narrative control to them. Unnoticed details or paths not chosen could very well change a player's interpretation, thus creating a multitude of readings. In this way, Virginia exemplifies Roland Barthes' writerly text, a text that requires more from the reader than simply absorbing the words on the page or the images on the screen. The text must allow the reader to produce meaning through the interpretation of what is written and or shown. As Barthes explains, there's more there. As Barthes explains, quote, "To interpret a text is not to give it a more or less justified, more or less free meaning, but on the contrary, to appreciate what plural constitutes it," end quote. Virginia's plurality of meaning is predicated upon its main ludic activity, looking. The game succeeds in its ambition by adapting cinematic techniques to the medium and, in doing so transforms spectatorship into a ludic activity. So to account for Virginia's narrative requires a theory of narrative that considers the active participation of the spectator. In his seminal work, Narration in the Fiction Film, David Bordwell provides an account of narration in which the viewer of film is involved in a dynamic process of executing assumptions, inferences, and hypotheses via cues derived from that film that he calls the constructivist theory of narration. Bordwell's work represents a break from theretofore traditional concepts of narration, mimetic and diegetic theories, that Bordwell claims favor mediums other than film and neither account for the subjective spectator, and I would argue also games. Bordwell's constructivist theory foregoes the preoccupation of the spectator's position of the mimetic and diegetic accounts to focus on how the text leads the viewer to execute a definable variety of operations that constitute their mental experience of the narrative. This dynamic psychological process foregrounds three factors: perceptual capacities, the bottom-up processes of our perception like flicker fusion and apparent motion, prior knowledge and experience, a drawing on schemata derived from our transactions from the everyday world, from other artworks and other films, and that's where I think it really sort of ties into what Toya was talking about earlier. And the material and structure of the text itself, those cues, patterns, and gaps that shape the viewer's application of schemata and the testing of hypotheses. Bordwell notes that while these factors can be isolated in theory, in practice they are intertwined and all but inseparable. But for the purpose of this paper, I'm going to focus on the latter two factors, prior knowledge and experience, and the material and structure of the text, to build an argument for how Virginia remediates the constructivist theory of film spectatorship in video games. Before I get into a reading of the text, though, I want to spend just a bit more time on Bordwell's classification of the schemata, drawn upon in a spectator's utilization of prior knowledge to comprehend a narrative. He identifies three major categories: the prototype schemata, the template schemata, and the procedural schemata, and each represents a larger structure that the previous schemata operate within. Prototype schemata are useful when trying to understand individual characters, settings, actions, goals, etc. Understanding the protagonists in Virginia, for instance, involves applying prototypes of partners and law enforcement. Next, template schemata function as a framework or a filing system, in Bordwell's terms, within which the viewer attempts to fit the prototype schemata into a larger system based on other narratives. These schemata assist in filling in gaps of information. Template schemata apply to structural characteristics like temporality and causality. Finally, prototype and template schemata are subsumed by the procedural schemata, or those operational protocols which dynamically acquire and organize information input. Those his words. Those processes operate according to procedural rationale, such as compositional or the justification of, quote, material in terms of its relevance to story necessity, end quote, realistic, or according to notions of plausibility derived from the conception of the way things work in the world, transtextual, or according to established motifs of the genre or medium, and artistic, to justify material in terms of its own sake, its artistic merit. These schemata account for the mental processes undergone by the spectator in their experience and interpretation of narrative elements presented to them. Understanding these processes allow filmmakers and game designers to develop and exploit them to deliver a range of intended experiences to the spectator through the structure and materials of the text. Moving back and forth. I didn't want to read the whole thing to you. Okay. So, how does this play out in the game? I argue that players uncover the fabula by participating in the divulgement of the Shuzet. Here we'll see characterization basically communicated to the player through the environment. This is the player character waking up in her apartment to get ready to go to work at the FBI. So you'll notice that the walls are bare, there are boxes everywhere, and that remains the case for the space throughout the game. So the wardrobe is empty as well, right? So she's living outside of those boxes. She has no life other than her work, and this is not communicated in any other way except for wandering around in the space. The only thing that's unpacked seems to be the computer that she probably uses for work, right? On the counter you can see takeout boxes. So she's not really cooking at home, she's just sort of eating and sleeping and working. It's an office away from the office. And in fact, later in the game, there is a dream in which she's envisioning a brighter future, and the apartment looks completely different. She even has a table set up for friends to come over and have dinner with her. Okay, so this is later in the game at your partner's house, Halprin. This space offers some exposition without overt narration. You'll notice at the end of the hallway here, there is a room that is completely optional to go into. To continue the game, you keep walking down there. But players can walk into this room and they notice the empty hospital bed there, right? Already sort of an embedded narrative that is indicative of quite a few narrative options. I'm going to skip through this, sorry. As you leave, you see also, that's where you go to end the state. You can also walk into the bathroom that's been modified to handle someone with end-of-life care, right? So all of this is shown to the player, enough that we can infer this relationship between the player character's partner and her mother, we find out there. And all of this is without stopping the game for cutscenes or 20-minute codec conversations. Okay, so this responsibility on the part of the player to uncover pertinent information is not to suggest that Virginia leaves players to their own devices. In fact, Virginia communicates to the player very specific modes of looking through its very structure and content. For instance, because the game uses a first-person perspective, the act of looking is already privileged through the very way that the game is presented. Likewise, that the player character is an investigator for the FBI provides reason for the player to look closely at details. The game provides these sort of template schemata to encourage players to respond as they've been conditioned to through other similar media and experience. I've mentioned already the pop culture influences on the game from shows like X-Files and Twin Peaks. These transtextual references invite players to make assumptions about characters and events in Virginia based on their knowledge of these similar texts. For instance, players can easily assume why Halprin, her partner's office, is way down in the basement of the FBI office, or why Tarver has been assigned to investigate her. Memories of Dale Cooper enjoying coffee infuses the diner in Virginia with an eerie familiarity. Moreover, Virginia presents itself much like a film, from the opening credits to the editing, the musical score, and even its duration. And this communicates to its player how to interact with it, specifically through the act of looking or framing the narrative information within the point of view of the camera. Okay, so next I want to look at a couple of scenes that show 2-3 minutes. Okay, maybe just one scene then. So in this dream state, in this scene, you wake up in a dream state. Let's skip through, sorry. Here is the dream. You're walking through. And the game puts you right back in the place that you went to sleep in, right? It's almost exactly the same. And I think that's a bet on the developer's case that you're going to start looking around on the theme to click. Before you know it, that enters your view, right? And then this light directs your gaze behind you. The scene ends when that door is centered, right? So I'm arguing that the game uses elements of level design to move the player through the act of looking there. So at the start of this paper, I claim that Virginia represents a potential shift in the way we think about games and film, and how they are different and how they are similar. The game proceduralizes the action of the player, not through any actual literary procedural codes and rules, but through a co-option of the player's psychological processes. It uses suggestion and cues as much as affordances and constraints to lead them through the experience to a desired, albeit inherently plural because of the dependency on the player's inferences, outcome. This in turn creates not the forking paths in the vein of traditional notions of interactive film, but a multiplicity of reading possibilities in the way that explodes Barth's writerly text into